I want to start with your Twitter thread that you made a few weeks ago. And you just have ways of framing things that I haven't heard before. And when you say them, a light switch goes on. I think there's something powerful to vocabulary, because we have sort of a gut feeling, but if we don't know how to express it, we're sort of incoherent. Let me read a couple of the tweets, and then I'd love you just to expand on that for our viewers. You said, question, what should government do to address climate change? That's a pretty neutral question, and I think it's asked.
It seems neutral. It's very non-neutral, but it seems neutral. And
let me ask you, read your answer, and then I'd love you just to take it away, and I'll be hanging on your every word, and so will our viewers. Your answer was, climate change is the wrong target. We want to reduce climate danger, and the proven way to do that is master climate danger by letting us use all forms of cost-effective energy, including fossil fuels. I'm just going to read one more tweet, and then I'm going to ask you to take it away. You say, asking how government should, quote, address climate change assumes that us impacting climate must be a bad thing, but it's only bad if it endangers us by creating challenges we can't master. And so far, our climate mastery has far outpaced any new climate challenges. What do you mean by climate mastery?
It's one of these things where people don't talk about it, but it's just an incredibly common sense thing. So one question I like to ask people who think, we've ruined the climate is, would you rather live in the climate today or the climate 100 years ago? Like, if you want to be safe from climate, would you rather be in the 1920s or the 2020s? I mean, what's your answer, Ezra?
Well, I mean, I know the answer because I study these things. I know that we've mastered the climate with air conditioning in the summer, with heating in the winter, with, building up protection for floods, dams. So I think I know the answer, but I know it in my own vocabulary. I want to hear it in your vocabulary because the way you talk about it, I think it's like a light switch goes on.
So and I think, I agree with you, obviously, but I think I want to just bring it back to common sense, and then I want to give some language around it. But the common sense is, obviously I want to live in the climate now versus the climate in the past, because our level of mastery now is so much greater than it was back then, and particularly even more so in poorer parts of the world, that whatever has changed in the climate for the negative, it totally outweighs that. And you can see this with the data that I share frequently is we have a 98% decline in the rate of what's called climate-related disaster deaths. So these are deaths from storms and floods and temperature extremes and wildfires. If you just think about it, then what does this really show? What it shows is that the livability of the climate, and in particular the safety of the climate, is a product of two things. One is, what's the actual state of the global climate system, and then the local climate you happen to live in. But then the other thing is, what's your level of mastery of it? And that's what determines the climate livability. And we have to factor in both. And my point is, what we really want is we want a livable and safe climate, right? Nobody should want, hey, I want the climate that existed in 1850 just because that came before the Industrial Revolution. Like, why would you deify the climate of 1850 versus any other? What you want is a livable climate. But what we've seen from history is the number one key to a livable climate is mastery. And the United States is a perfect example of this, because the United States has an incredibly diverse set of climates. We have an Arctic area with Alaska, and we have like humid, swampy Florida, and we have scorching Texas, and we have, a lot of Arizona, which is totally unlivable, close to that before air conditioning. And now we can live to 80 in every single state. But just think of that. Whatever the climate conditions, including the weather conditions, we can thrive. We can, as I like to say, we can flourish. And so what that shows is that the real thing that matters to climate livability is climate mastery. Now, what does this have to do with fossil fuels? Well, one thing is, if we have a high level of mastery, you just generally shouldn't be afraid of new climate challenges unless they're a total difference of kind. So the fact that we're so obsessed with, quote, climate change doesn't really make any sense, because it's one of the things we're better at dealing with. I mean, we've supposedly had so much, quote, climate change over the last 100 years, and yet we're much safer than ever from climate. So one thing is to just reassure people and stop terrorizing kids. But then the other thing is, if you look at what causes the mastery, it's hugely the fossil fuels we're blaming for causing the climate change. So it's the fossil fuels are powering the irrigation systems that help make drought 1/100th threat it used to be. The fossil fuels are powering all the machines that build the sturdy buildings and power the storm warning systems and the evacuation systems that make us safe from storms. Of course, they're powering the heating and air conditioning. So it's so odd because actually fossil fuels are making climate far more livable when you look at it from a human livability perspective, and yet they're demonized as climate villains. So it's exactly, everyone's wrong, right? Everyone thinks either fossil fuels are terrible for the climate or they're not so bad. But it's actually, they're the best thing that's ever happened to the livability of climate.
I think what you're saying, and again, I don't want to nitpick, but it's sort of interesting how you phrase it. Would I rather live in the climate today or 100 years ago or 100 years from now? The answer really isn't based on the climate itself, because it's going to be pretty similar. It's our technology. So there was nothing particularly wrong with the climate 100 years ago or 500 years ago. It's that we didn't have the tools to deal with it. So what you're really saying is human ingenuity is the difference. And although, let me read another one of your tweets because it's interesting. You said, it's an irrefutable but little known fact that as the world has warmed 1 degree Celsius, humans have become safer than ever from climate danger. The rate of climate-related disaster deaths, and you mentioned that, has fallen 98%. So you acknowledge that the Earth has very slowly, very gradually warmed. But you're saying as it's warmed, our ability to deal with warmth, droughts, whatever, has improved greatly. It's not, the climate change is a snail's pace, but our technological change is at a breakneck pace.
Right. It was, the way I put it is, right, the climate mastery far outpaces any new climate challenges. And part of the reason I put it as climate challenges, which is a bit of a new phraseology for me, is that actually things in climate aren't really negative unless you can't master them. So you take something like, okay, well, the world gets warmer in certain kinds of ways, but then you can benefit from that. Look at the migration in the United States. People moving to Texas and to Florida, like, they don't mind that in many, many ways. People are going from New York to Florida. That's a much more dramatic climate change than any catastrophist projects for the Earth, right? But they're making it voluntarily. And even you take something like a storm, like the same storm that would have destroyed your home and ruined your life 200 years ago could be the romantic setting for an evening with one's wife or partner now. So it's like our mastery really determines how livable a climate is. And here's something that will trigger people, including, I think, many conservatives, but in the future, we're going to figure out how to master climate on wider scales. So we're going to figure out how do we neutralize hurricanes. And people are probably going to figure out, people are already like feeding clouds to alleviate drought, which I think is a really good thing. But we already have a lot of ways we know of cooling the Earth and warming the Earth in different kinds of ways. And in general, and that raises some interesting policy questions, but in general, people are going to want a climate that's more livable. I live in Southern California. They make us pay a fortune to live here, and we have to deal with Gavin Newsom. I think in the future, freer places are going to try to replicate a California-esque climate. And that's part of the project of climate mastery, and it's part of why it's insane for the world to be obsessed with relatively small changes in temperature when we should be obsessed with increasing our mastery over the Earth.
That's an excerpt from the Ezra Levant Show. I'm Ezra Levant, and every weekday I do a monologue about the most interesting subject in the news. Then I interview a fascinating guest. Could be a politician, could be an activist, could be someone from overseas. Then I read a little bit of fan mail and a little bit of hate mail and do it again the next day. My friend Sheila Gunn-Reid does a weekly show too. You can get both by going to rebelnewsplus.com. I think it's the most interesting content you'll find in Canada.